And I think both sides are guilty of trying to intimidate the other. The Israelis, unfortunately, have the upper hand. They have the money, they have the capability to do that so effectively to a people that they have now imprisoned.
The following account is true. It is the story of Lynn Gras, a nurse currently living in San Diego, California. During March and April of 2002, Lynn volunteered to travel to Israel and Lebanon, where she planned to provide free medical help for sick Palestinian babies, train the medical staffs at the hospital she visited, and establish neonatal intensive care units. As she traveled from place to place during her 6-week journey, Lynn was stopped and searched by Israeli soldiers stationed at checkpoints along the way. At one of these checkpoints, a soldier asked her to explain why she wanted to help Palestinian children. But he did not wait for Lynn to answer. Instead, he answered for her. "This is not California," he told her. "This is not your war." Lynn did not agree. Instead, she made a promise to tell others about what she saw during those 6 weeks in Palestine. And this is her story. When we interviewed Lynn, she introduced herself and explained what she wanted to accomplish during her trip to Palestine. She also identified some of her concerns about the trip.
I'm Lynn Gras. I'm a traveling nurse in the Midwest of America. I went back to the Middle East. This was the 3rd time that I've been to the Middle East. And it was the 2nd time to go to the Middle East on refugee work. Over the U.S., I teach doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists. It was the 2nd trip for the PCRF. The 1st trip was to Lebanon, South Lebanon, and Sidon, to teach and to help a refugee hospital in El Hamshri refugee camp set up a neonatal intensive care unit. So the PCRF, or actually the Red Crescent Society in Lebanon, asked me to come back and do that again. And Steve from the PCRF said, "Would you be willing to go into Palestine this time?" And I said, "Sure. I've probably got 6 weeks this year to volunteer. Just send me where I would be the most useful." So, and we talked about the situation in Palestine on numerous occasions before I left, because Steve knows the area really well. I trust his judgment. He does really good work over there. But I wasn't sure how safe it was going to be. Every day that I looked at the news, it looked like it was getting worse. But Steve said to me, it's going to be this way. These people still need your help. It's safe for humanitarian aid workers. And I also consulted with a friend of mine who's in the State Department, who said, things are probably going to get worse, but you got a good head on your shoulders. Just go. I know you like to do this kind of stuff. So I went.
To understand Lynn's concerns about traveling in Palestine, it may help to trace the region's history and identify the sources of tension between today's Israeli government and the Palestinians. And that means stepping back in time nearly 1,400 years. Although it's now forgotten, from the time of the Arab conquest in the 7th century A.D. until the middle of the 20th century, the area now known as Israel was the shared home of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. During most of that long period of time, the degree of religious toleration experienced throughout the Islamic world was unmatched in Western Europe, which was considered a primitive backwater by comparison. With some exceptions, the predominantly Islamic population considered members of all 3 faiths to be people of the book, sharing a common root in monotheistic Judaism. During World War I, in an effort to defeat the Turkish rulers of Palestine, Britain negotiated a series of separate and conflicting treaties with France, Russia, and European Zionists who were seeking a homeland for the Jews. In addition, the British negotiated a treaty with the Palestinian Arabs who were promised their own independent state in exchange for rebelling against the Turks. These incompatible agreements and the betrayal of the Palestinians are the source of today's problems. After World War I, and as a result of the tragic Holocaust in Europe during World War II, the rate of Jewish settlement in Palestine increased, and conflicts broke out between Palestinians and the Jewish settlers. In effect, the Europeans, who had been unable to resolve racism and strife within the borders of Europe, had exported their conflict to Palestine. This took place with the consent of the international community, including the United States. It is important to note that after the discovery of oil in the Middle East during the 1920s and 30s, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union each took a keen interest in the region. During the Cold War years and its aftermath, these nations took an active role in orchestrating political developments there, intervening openly, secretly, and frequently in the internal political struggles taking place throughout the Middle East. In Palestine, the British ruled openly until May of 1948. When their troops departed, a full-scale war broke out. When the conflict ended, the Jewish settlers had taken control of what is now known as the State of Israel. The remainder of Palestine was divided among Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, governments that were not concerned with the plight of the Palestinians. Israel now controls both the original territory gained in 1948 and areas that were occupied during the Six-Day War in 1967, namely the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Within the original pre-1967 territory, Israel is an apartheid state divided by religion. Within this territory, all citizens must carry cards that identify them as Jew, Muslim, or Christian. Non-Jews are second-class citizens and are subject to more than 20 discriminatory laws. These laws define different levels of land ownership rights, access to private and public employment, the availability of loans and mortgages, and access to a university education. There also are vast disparities in public spending for schools, health care, roads, electricity, clean water, and social services between Jews and non-Jews. Not surprisingly, unemployment and poverty among Palestinians are much higher than in the Jewish population. In the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip, Israeli administration resembles that of a prison camp. The Palestinians live in a crowded, closely controlled environment surrounded by barriers patrolled continuously by Israeli troops. They are subject to frequent shelling or bombing from F-16 jets supplied by the United States. Access is tightly controlled at checkpoints where Palestinians are herded into giant holding pens where they wait for hours in long lines, subject to searches, threats, and gunfire by Israeli guards before being allowed to pass from one area into another, whether simply going to work, visiting friends, or family members. In close proximity to these Palestinian zones, often perched atop nearby hills, are brand new Israeli settlements guarded by modern weapons purchased for the Israelis by the U.S. government. These conditions have existed in one form or another for more than 50 years. But at the time of Lynn Gras's visit, she was particularly concerned about rising tensions and outbreaks of violence. For example, there had been a series of attacks on Palestinian residential and business districts, including the destruction by tanks, bombs, and helicopters of airports, neighborhoods, fishing boats, broadcasting facilities, and state-sponsored assassinations. Similarly, there had been Palestinian sniping incidents and a rash of suicide bombings. Lynn arrived in Jerusalem on March 9th, and we will trace her journey to Gaza, her return to Jerusalem, and arrival in Bethlehem. her experience with Israeli tanks while stationed at the hospital in Ramallah, and her return to Jerusalem before embarking on the final leg of her journey, a taxi drive that took her through Amman, Jordan, and a flight to Beirut, Lebanon, where she remained until returning to the United States on April 20th. When Lynn first arrived in Jerusalem, she was met by Steve Sosebee of the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund.
Steve Sosebee is the head of the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. He's a really good guy. He's from Kent, Ohio. That's where the PCR office is based. He actually was a journalist who went to the Middle East about 10 to 12 years ago on human rights issues.
Lynn traveled with Steve Sosebee to the Shifa Hospital in Gaza on Monday, March 11th, and it was necessary for Steve to return to Jerusalem before nightfall because it's dangerous to pass through the checkpoints at night. Shifa Hospital has been treating sick babies for 20 years, but that task is made more difficult because the hospital lacks equipment. Equipment needs repair, and supplies of disposable items, even linens to wrap the babies, are irregular or are blocked by Israeli soldiers. Nonetheless, the nurses do the best they can, often reusing supplies and using equipment in novel ways. Working 16-hour days and teaching as she worked, Lynn discovered that the hospital was plagued by staff shortages, that patients delivered babies and died trying to get to the hospital because of delays in passing through the checkpoints.
They didn't have enough staff. This was a chronic problem there, not enough staff. And with the checkpoints in and around Gaza, I mean, Gaza itself is divided into thirds, and to get from one point to another in Gaza is very difficult. For not only patients, Shifa Hospital is a regional referral center for neonatal intensive care. So they take the babies that are born in the outlying clinics or hospitals, and they take the sickest ones there. Women who are going to deliver that are going to have problems need to get to Shifa to deliver. They can deliver out, but they don't get as good a care. But in this oppressive situation where the checkpoints are in effect all the time, and now in certain parts curfews 24 hours, to get to the medical care that you need and the center that you need is impossible. So you have babies that should make it into the neonatal intensive care or should be born there because a mother should have come in early, and they don't make it. They don't make it to the hospital. They don't make it. They die in the clinics because they don't get the care that they need because of the checkpoints.
During her first night in Gaza, Lynn was awoken by the sound of voices, only to discover in the morning that a tragedy had occurred.
Went to bed kind of early, and then didn't sleep really well because there was voices in the house to all hours of the night. I just woke up a couple times, and I remember somebody coming up to the floor. I was on the second floor, and I think just checking in on me. I don't really know what they were doing, or I didn't know until later. But the next morning woke up, and the chauffeur and the cook had said to me, well, yeah, there were voices in the house at all hours of the night because there was meetings between the emergency physicians at Shifa Hospital and the Ministry of Health because the Israelis came into Jabalia refugee camp last night and killed 19 people and injured more than 100.
The hospital was in a state of emergency, taking care of the victims. As a citizen of the United States, Lynn felt particularly responsible for the injuries because her U.S. tax dollars were used to support the Israeli government. In the last 50 years, the U.S. government provided Israel with more than $81 billion in aid, much of it used to purchase armaments. Currently, aid is pegged at $3 billion a year, in addition to loans provided at special rates. And I remember one of the nurses was crying. I helped her start an IV on a baby, and she didn't know me. I was just some American that was over there, humanitarian aid. Steve sent her over, but I helped her start an IV, and she said to me that she was crying because one of her brothers had been killed last night, and she was at the hospital working. On March 17th, a Sunday, Lynn took a taxi to Jerusalem and retrieved the bundle of supplies that she'd set aside for the Caritas Baby Hospital in Bethlehem. Because the Israelis have divided Palestine into so many sectors, it was very difficult to guide a visitor through the checkpoints to Bethlehem. When she arrived in Bethlehem, Lynn stayed in a small Benedictine monastery located near the Caritas Baby Hospital.
So when I walked in, there was a baby that was turning blue, his heart rate was dropping. And I walked right in and basically kind of talked them through a neonatal resuscitation, which is what I teach. And I think God put you in the right place at the right time for certain things, and that was just a perfect introduction to, this is Lynn, she's an American nurse, she's here to teach resuscitation, and they listened to me really well after that.
While in Bethlehem, Lynn learned how the Israeli practice of turning the water supply on and off arbitrarily led to something called Waterfest. She also learned that the simple act of going to work is arduous and risky for the doctors at the hospital.
I had interesting talks with a lot of the people that I worked with. I was educated in things like water fests and what are water fests. The cook was telling me that she had been recently there. I think she had been there a couple years, and recently after she got there, a lot of her staff had come into work really tired, but clean, and really tired, and she asked them why, what's wrong. She said, oh, well, the water was turned on at 2 in the morning this morning. I had been off for 10 days, and that's usual to be cut off, especially in the hot summer months. They just cut off the water for like 10 days at a time. Nobody knows when it's going to be turned back on. But it gets turned back on, and you wake your neighbors up, and you do your washing, and you scrub the floors, and you take a shower, and after 10 days of not having any water. And that's just normal stuff there. One of the physicians I worked with there, Dr. Jamal, had worked for about 10 years in the U.S., and had gone back to Palestine to help his people out, and he was from there. And he said, never in my life would I ever have thought that I would have to walk across the mountains for 3 hours to get to work, carrying nothing. Otherwise I'd be suspicious and shot. And he also said one other thing that I won't forget. He said that normal people, regular people, are being driven to fanaticism because of the oppression. While I was there were a few suicide bombings in Jerusalem, and he was just telling me, I could never excuse suicide bombings. Nobody can. But if you see the on-the-ground situation in the West Bank, in the Palestinian territories, you come to an understanding of how that atmosphere can breed desperation enough that people are willing to do that.
There are 2 bad checkpoints at Ramallah. The second one is worse. While passing through it, Lynn saw the soldiers fire a gun to frighten an old woman. And when Lynn finally reached the guards and stated her reason for visiting Ramallah, she was told by the soldiers, "This is not California, this is not your war." It was at Ramallah that Lynn became familiar with the term checkpoint babies. These babies are born at checkpoints because the Israeli soldiers posted there refuse to believe that the women are actually in labor. One consequence of delivering babies at checkpoints is a high incidence of premature deliveries. The other is death. Lynn discovered that Ramallah Government Hospital was a large, busy facility with a high staff turnover and chronic shortages. For her first 5 days there, Lynn was able to follow a schedule of hands-on teaching in the neonatal intensive care unit and formal classroom lectures. Each night, she returned to her hotel. As she passed through the city streets, she was struck by the number of bullet holes and the damage inflicted on buildings and infrastructure. Ramallah had suffered a tank attack only 2 weeks before her arrival, and Lynn was to see another such incursion with her own eyes. Tensions began to rise when the Palestinian delegation walked out of the Arab summit being held in Beirut because Yasser Arafat's speech was not aired. On the same day, 29 people were killed and over 100 wounded when a suicide bomber blew himself up in Netanya. Lynn recalls how rapidly the situation in Ramallah changed as a result.
About the 5th day into it, I was teaching in the library, and Firas came up to me at the end of one of my classes that I taught, and he said, "There's 150 tanks surrounding Ramallah." There had been a suicide bombing in Netanya the night before, and everyone kind of was waiting to see what Israel would do. So they were going to come in, it looked like. So Firas said, "You have 3 choices. You can either you can go back to your hotel and stay there and get stuck there. You could go to my mom's house, probably get stuck there, but probably be safe there. You can grab your stuff from the hotel and come to the hospital and get stuck here. But I'm a nurse, so where should I be? The hospital is probably the best place for me, and probably the safest as well. Who's going to come into the hospital?"
The following night, tanks entered the city and surrounded Yasser Arafat's headquarters. At the same time, heavy shelling began, moving closer to the hospital each day. Lynn, a trained emergency room nurse, helped to treat the flood of victims, men, women, and children. Some of the wounds seemed suspicious. Single gunshots administered to the heads of old men. They appeared to have been executed. Lynn noted that after the first day of violence, Israeli soldiers refused to let ambulances reach the hospital. As a result, many victims bled to death.
You can't have a patient sitting in an ambulance. It doesn't work. An ambulance is there for immediate transport because you have a critically ill patient. You delay the ambulance for minutes and you're playing with somebody's life. You delay them for hours, which was what was happening there. And you're killing them.
The conflict also caused shortages of blood and food at the hospital, and the entire staff was already donating their own blood. The only place without a shortage was the morgue. It was piled with corpses. When Lynn thought it could get no worse, the hospital itself was besieged.
I was actually feeding a baby in the neonatal intensive care unit. And 2 nurses ran down the hall that I had been working with and said, "There are soldiers in the hospital now." And they were really scared. They looked scared. And I didn't know what to do. I was an American caught in a situation like them, but I was different than them. And it's hard to know what you're supposed to do in that situation. The bellies of the tanks were open, and there were soldiers with guns pointed to about 30 to 40 hospital personnel with surgical caps on, scrubs on, that had formed like a barrier between the tanks and the soldiers and the hospital. Later on, we heard on CNN that the Israelis said that the Palestinians had made that up just to inflame people. But I was there. It was Easter Sunday, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and there were soldiers in the hospital.
Fortunately, the Italian delegation appeared at that moment and began taking pictures, despite threats from the soldiers. After a standoff of an hour and a half, the Geneva Red Cross appeared and the soldiers withdrew. The doctors and nurses thanked Lynn for her standing with them to block the hospital entrance, but they warned her to leave while she could.
They said to me that they're going to come back, and because I had probably stood with them, I was in more danger than I had been before, and they thought it was probably prudent and wise that I not stay any longer. So I grabbed my stuff. I had kept it ready just in case. And I grabbed my stuff and I wheeled it down the hall, past the neonatal intensive care unit and past the ER, saying goodbye to everyone that I had worked with. Many people pressed my hand and said, we're sorry that you have to leave, but we know you have to leave, and it's better if you leave now. But it was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, is to leave people that you are working with, that are in a really hard situation. They're fellow healthcare workers, nurses that are doing the best job that they can. I taught them, they taught me, and I was leaving them on the advice of many people, but I could. I'm an American. I can get out. They can't. They're stuck there.
On April 1st, Lynn returned to Jerusalem for a few days before taking a taxi to Amman, Jordan, for a flight to Beirut, Lebanon. At a nearby refugee camp, she continued to train doctors and nurses until returning to San Diego on April 20th. Knowing her friends were trapped in a worsening situation in Ramallah, however, made her feel sick and helpless, so she began to send emails to people who knew her. While speaking to reporters being interviewed and seeing how reporters would edit their stories, Lynn began to understand media bias, especially American newspapers and broadcasters who would concoct outright lies while on the air, knowing that they had to pre-package the news to fit a certain acceptable point of view. Lynn had made a promise to tell her people, to tell Americans, what she'd seen, so that Americans would push for a more balanced view of Palestine. She also saw Palestinians who did not hate Americans, but they asked why the United States government did this to them, why it was so pro-Israel. Lynn saw fear on both sides, but she knew that both sides needed to live together. She summed it up with a single wish for Palestine.
They are in a prison. My wish is that they would be able to live free